to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss Black Swans and the precautionary principle in the context of Nassim Taleb's thought. So, Tim, you've been interested in Nassim Taleb for a while. Could you give the audience an idea as to why that's the case?
Nassim Taleb is a significant thinker in this century. And Nassim Taleb's first book and what he got famous for is Fooled by Randomness. I would argue it's his best work. And Fooled by Randomness, as Gary North would say, is a frontal assault on all sorts of people, from mainstream economists, finance gurus, experts, academia, Gaussian statistics. It's a real laundry list of attacks that Nassim Taleb and Fooled by Randomness makes against the sort of mainstream. And it's almost proto-Austrian libertarian. Actually, it's through Nassim Taleb that I actually got into Austrian libertarianism. And as people like Brian Kaplan and others point out, Nassim Taleb's references in his, I forget the exact name, his bibliography, whatever you want to call that, the reference list of what Nassim Taleb cites, citation list, is just amazing. I mean, he has a large laundry list of different thinkers, the Stoics, the ancient Greeks, and so forth. So yeah, I mean, that's how I sort of discovered Nassim Taleb. Michael Miles found Ayn Rand based on the cover. I found him because he was in a talk with Neil Ferguson. I just happened to read a Neil Ferguson book at my local library about the World War I, and that's how I got into Nassim Taleb. I think Nassim Taleb is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, his main thing, before I get to why I think, one of the reasons why I like him, I think he has influenced both the left and the right. In an interview with Nick Gillespie, Nick Gillespie asked him what his viewpoint is, and he said he's a left-wing conservative. And I actually think the more I think about it, the more I think it's true. Because one of the things that Nassim Taleb can be good at, and I'm going to get to this in the end, he's very good at defending things that the left likes actually better. And this was definitely the case with coronavirus or COVID-19, whatever you want to call it. It's also true with climate change as well. Nassim Taleb arguably is better at defending climate change alarmism or COVID alarmism than the mainstream is, because he doesn't use models. He uses his precautionary principle, and he uses his Black Swan theory, which comes out of Fooled by Randomness. So I'm going to say I still like Taleb even after the pandemic, even though I'm a COVID skeptic. I still like Taleb. And one of the reasons why I like Taleb, and in our second podcast on our first podcast on Taleb, you said you described would he ever admit he's wrong, and you said his ego has its own gravitational field, and I think that's true. But interestingly, that's one of the reasons why I like him. I think there's a sort of a refreshing side to his large ego, especially when you agree with him. I mean, if you're going to write a book like Fooled by Randomness or Black Swan, which just takes on these sort of the Black Scholes model, I think it's called, all the mainstream finance people, they have their own egos too. You would take on the nudgers and all those groups. It's not like Taleb is the only person with an ego. But his ego is it is large, and it is quite refreshing. And the Weinstein brothers were both or annoyed or marveling about his behavior on Twitter, because he is just a lunatic on Twitter at times. And he'll do things like leave 1-star reviews for like Charles Murray books, which, you can take it or leave it there. But I would argue it takes someone with that kind of Ubermensch ego to write a book like this. But nonetheless, let's get out of that stuff. So many Ron Paul libertarians and Milton Friedmanites aren't that radical when it comes to epistemology in a way. Hayek isn't that radical either. I mean, they don't really reject mainstream economic statistics. Brian Kaplan clearly states that. David Friedman even states that in his debate with Bob Murphy. Some statistics are better than none. Some data is better than no data. So Taleb, in some ways, positions himself as either a hypermodeler, because this is where things are going to get tricky. I think this is more of your expertise with it. I wanted to get in that later. But Nassim Taleb sort of positions himself in a unique position. And as Gary North points out, Nassim Taleb might be almost proto-postmodernist and throws the baby out of the bathwater. And that is a criticism that you can make. But this is partly a point that hinges on what exactly are predictions. One of the problems I have, so Nassim Taleb's basic idea is you can't predict a lot of things. Well, you can't predict them well, and in particular, you can't predict Black Swans events. And the Black Swan event, and this is what his definition is, a Black Swan is an extremely rare event with severe consequences. And some characteristics of them. They're big events, they're non-Gaussian, they're non-predictable, and they're not easily modelable. Now, Taleb may or may not think they're modelable. This is in some ways Taleb uses. This is where Taleb's math. He's against math in some ways, but in some ways he just wants better math, and that's the tricky thing which separates him from the Misean Austrians, who sort of reject statistical models or models, and well, they reject empirical models, to be precise, from my understanding. And there might not be evidence for them. So he's not an evidence-based thinker either. That's another reason why I like him, because people like Mises, when you go out, they're not going to test the minimal age of evidence. It's sort of an a priori synthetic idea. So Taleb is somewhere in between the two, and at times occupies no theory, which actually is a sort of both criticism and feature. One of the problems with his one of the problems in general I have with prediction, and this is brought up in a story called Appointment in Samara. And so, like, let's say you're going to predict you're going to predict there's a storm coming. Okay. If the storm comes, your prediction is right. Okay, but here's the trouble and this is the trouble with social phenomena. If you're going to predict there's a financial crisis coming, but then then the government's going to say, oh, this predictor is really right all the time. We better have a stimulus plan. Okay, and then you put a stimulus plan in. And then the crisis doesn't happen. Was the predictive model correct or incorrect? I don't know. I mean, this is a sort of strange Narnia world type situation where if you have a model and people change their behavior based on that model, and now the prediction is no longer correct, you get into this funny thing about things. And Black Swan events, to me, are the key events in history too. And this is another thing that history, and wars, great floods, the Big Bang, all sorts of events. Now, whether or not, and this is where Taleb gets into black swans, gray swans, and white swans. And sometimes for me, it's not always clear. There's a clear demarcation between the three, because it always becomes like, to the turkey, the butcher killing them after being fed for 299 days is a black swan event, but to the farmer, that's known. To everyone else is known the turkey's going to get slaughtered after being fed for 299 days. So it's partly a point of view problem related to the prediction. And Taleb would argue, and I think Ron Paul and Hoppe and Mises would argue, that financial crises and Great Depressions we know they're going to happen. And this goes into the weeds of sort of prediction and predictive events, But when a big financial crisis happens, it is a large event. So it's the second half of his definition. It's a severe event. It's not a small event. So I would say most of history is made up of what you could call, the significant events in history are black swan events or non-Gaussian events. Much of history happens in a few days, and then everything else, doesn't happen. And this is how I use Taleb's Fooled by Randomness and Black Swan to argue against my political science department, to say why political science is not very good at modeling wars. Because, look, World War II and World War I are much more significant than Grenada, even Korea. And Korea was more significant to the Koreans themselves, but globally, the most significant war was World War II and World War I, by far. Invasion of Kuwait, those are small wars. Those are small wars. So those are the big, and the same way with crimes. The big crimes, they're unpredictable in certain ways. They're unpredictable to the mass. They might not be predictable. They'll be predictable to the criminals themselves can predict them, but that's more like just willing things to happen. That's not someone else doing them. I've already discussed financial crisis and so forth. So those, I would say, are the general ideas of what a black swan event is. World War I was a key black swan event because you remember a lot of people had all these very fancy models that said, look, we have lots of international trade, we have lots of new technology that's going to make long wars impossible. No one wants to do wars. because all the rulers are related. They're all Democrats. Why are we? Well, whether or not Woodrow Wilson thought that Germany was a democracy is some interesting question. But nonetheless, you have all these sort of books out. The End of Wars. This is before 1914. And this also is the long peace. Taleb has a paper on wars too. I mean, we had a long peace since 1945. And Taleb also has worked on casualties. He says, like a few wars represent most of the deaths. Like the Falklands War, a few thousand. Even Vietnam for the Americans, a few thousand. But then, like 11 million, 10 million people will die in one war, in 2 years. These are incredibly outlier events. This is not an average thing. If you're going to cross a river, it's on average 4 feet deep. Well, partly it might be one section might be really deep, and the other section might be a few inches. And then his classic difference between weight and wealth. 90% of the wealth, 10% of the people have 90% of the wealth, but weight on the other hand, no one weighs 99%, 90% of all human weight. So black swans, they're unpredictable, and then there's severe consequences. They're not Gaussian, so you can't draw a simple curve to describe them. And this makes them annoying for mainstream academics because in some ways it's not scientific. Well, it's not scientific as defined by these Gaussian boring, I'll use air quote, boring models that can be easily done using like linear regression and other types of techniques, which they're convenient to do because that's what people have been doing for a while. But whether they actually explain reality, and particularly explain these major events that do much of the things, and in a few hours, you can bankrupt the whole country. I think this happened to Iceland. So you have lots of data. It's almost like the turkey. You have lots of data where this farmer's treating me very well. And so forth, and this brings us, which we'll get into COVID as well, or coronavirus. I prefer to call it coronavirus still, where Taleb has been an extreme alarmist very early on about this, and I still like him because he was basically consistent. He was wearing 2 masks and eye goggles way back when people like Joe Biden and all the other. As you brought up, your doctor friends were making fun of people wearing masks, saying there's no evidence that masks work. So you say, well, we're not looking for evidence that masks work. So I would still say that Taleb is more consistent, and he runs the Real World Risk Institute, and so forth. So I've done a long monologue about various things. I include some other things too, but I'm going to leave them out for now and I'll get back into them with them. But so far, what do you think of his Black Swan idea? The idea they're non-predictable, and as well as some of the other points. Swithin?
I think Taleb's main point, and the main thing that's interesting about him, is his focus upon singular events which change everything. Well, maybe not everything, but they change a lot of things, and they provide the groundwork for the time that takes place thereafter. So, for example, I mean, to a large extent, we still live in a post-Second World War age. If it wasn't for the Second World War, today would be very, very, very different. Now, I think that's correct. Whether black swans are purely black swans and they are not predictable is, as I say, this is somewhat less straightforward. I mean, what do we mean by predictable? So, for example, if you take related. I think he became very popular with the Black Swan in the context of the financial crash of 2008. That's what I remember him becoming more popular. The question was that 2008 crash actually predictable? Well, Peter Schiff claimed he predicted it, and so did various others. And the question is, when do you need to predict it? Is predicting it the day before still predicting the Black Swan event, or is it just are you completely blindsided by it? And so in a sense, I don't think a pure Black Swan event exists. Now, if Taleb sufficiently qualified what he meant, I think I might entirely agree. But I don't think things are entirely unpredictable. So, I mean, take, for example, the Austrian business cycle theory. It will state that, if you get credit expansion, you get expansion of unbacked. You have an increase in the money supply not backed by any commodity, or in a technical sense, fiduciary media. You will cause a decline in the interest rate, and you will cause an unsustainable boom. It might be very small if there's not much fiduciary media created, but it'll still take place. But so then the question is, well, okay, Mises says this is the classic Misesian position. You could disagree with him, but that's how Mises basically outlines his position. So we know that kind of crash is going to happen. We don't know how big it's going to be necessarily. We'd have to look at some more empirical data. But we know it will happen, but we're not sure when. So is that a grey swan? Is that a black swan? I think getting behind the big sort of black swan as a pure black swan idea is probably testament to Taleb's penchant for being somewhat flamboyant with his terms. I mean, that said, of course, the fat tail, is important. I mean, I was going to mention it, but which I'll repeat what you said. His points on averages is very interesting. It does not matter what the average depth of a lake is. What matters is how deep does it go at any one point. If you're walking across it, that is. You don't go, well, the average height is half an inch. Well, that's fine, I'll walk across it. But I didn't know that, most of it is like 1,000th of an inch, and one of it is like one part of it is, 20 feet deep. That, of course, is going to matter. Same things like temperature changes. He's used those examples before. And also sort of the idea of fragility is interesting. That, you can, like a coffee cup can sustain small vibrations quite a lot over time and it won't break. But if you get one like earthquake where it's sort of like high enough, it will then snap. And the same thing is with human bodies. You can take a decent amount of injuries, a small amount of injuries over a long time, and it won't kill you. But if you have one impact which is actually less than the cumulative impact of a small, so I suppose your hit, for example, I don't know, I have no idea what they are, but I don't know, 10 psi, 10 pounds per square inch of pressure over time. I don't think that makes much difference. Maybe it does. But you can imagine you could have a lot of those over a long period of time coming to a huge amount of pressure being hit upon you. But basically makes no difference to you. But if you have one impact of 1,000, that might kill you. So the focus on those is relevant. And then, obviously, not being able to use kind of the Gaussian, or he loves to call it Gaussian. Everyone else just calls them normal distributions. And this is another thing with Taleb. He seems to like using his own words for things just because they sound better. Not saying that Gaussian isn't used ever, but it isn't massively common. But on to statistics as such. He is odd, and as you point out, at one time he seems like he's completely against statistics, but other times he's sort of like the hyper-empiricist. At one point, I read an article recently, he basically claimed he was like a hardcore Popperian in sort of empirical investigation of like falsification, which is interesting given his critique of maths, because, as you point out, it is somewhat similar to the approach of, say, of Mises, who would say, well, you know what, for a lot of events, there's no point even using like normal distributions to try to predict what's going to happen, because we just don't have any idea what's going to happen. I don't know what Taylor's view on the basis of probability is, but I doubt it's what's called the frequentist theory. This was followed by Mises, followed by his brother, who was called Richard. Basically, the idea is you can predict a class of events. So a good example might be if you're an insurance company, you can predict reasonably accurately, because you've got lots of data over historical time periods, of which houses flood, how often it happens, and what the average payout is likely to be. And then you can create a business model based on that. You have reasonable certainty of the probability distribution of when flooding is going to occur, and then when you need to pay it out. And this is what they would call class probability. Mises, though, argues based on this that if you have an event which isn't within a class, it's a different form of event, then you simply can't ascribe a probability to it. So you're genuinely uncertain about it, which I suppose is to some extent similar with Taylor, although I don't 100% know what his actual view is on that because it's unclear. What is clear is he thinks his maths is better than everybody else's. But yeah, so his views broadly are sort of complementary to some extent with the Austrian views on sort of statistics. But in one way, he's less radical because he does think if your maths is sufficiently good, I mean, he goes on about how robust the models are. You know, can you change the variables and do sensitivity analysis, that kind of thing, to see what the result would be. Yeah, he, despite his bravado, he's not as skeptical as, say, someone like Ludwig or Mises would be on the use of statistics and probability. So that's what I'd say on his overall statistical approach. But I do think his view on the importance of, as it were, the fat tail is worth noting.
As far as your point about prediction, to me, needs to be stressed clearly. And whether or not I learned this from Taleb per se, but Taleb definitely put me on this way, on this sort of path. And prediction is something interesting. If you define science by predictability, okay, so like when people say that, you know, the astronomers can predict the movement of planets fairly well, or the movements of things fairly well, or, you know, yeah, objects rolling down the hill, or artillery shells, blah, blah, blah. Okay, these are things that are totally natural with a capital N, because in some sense humans are natural, if you take a naturalist epistemology. But the trouble is with, as Mises points out, human action. Okay, so like I'm going to predict I'm going to turn my mic off, okay? And I just did. I just turned my mic off for 1 second. Now, that prediction was 100% accurate. I could predict the time, the very second that was going to happen. Same with 9/11, as he pointed out to the terrorists. The 9/11 wasn't a black swan. And to the people in the towers, it was. You know, the tower is safe. No large building in the United States has fallen recently. Why worry about it being safe? You know, and the same thing with certain airplane crashes. Now this might be errors of omission, but you know, someone might have put the wrong type of fuel in. Maybe at some point in their training, they should have known that they should always check they put the right fuel in, and the plane crashes because they put the wrong fuel type in. Those type of things happen. So for some part of the action, they know somebody in the system might know an event's happening. You know, for Pearl Harbor, for example. Now, this is to take the mainstream account, take the mainstream historical account of Pearl Harbor. You know, the people knew that the Japanese pilots, they knew what they were doing. The people on the ships, they didn't know. So prediction to me is an interesting phenomena, especially when you can change or you can dictate the actions. And I say with an example of changing the weather. If you can change the weather, and the weathermen, if the phenomenon is sufficiently natural and out of our control, out of human action's control, then prediction may be possible and testable. But this gets into the sort of icky parts of what science is, and like, you know, this is one of the problems I have with the sort of falsification of the Popperi minutes, which Gary North is very critical of as a Mises as well. It's like there's a huge amount of phenomena that, you know, we have to just sort of rely on, like that aren't necessarily falsifiable. And actually, as some of the sort of Christian apologetics go after, like you could try to falsify Lincoln. You could say, well, Lincoln doesn't just prove to me Lincoln exists, you know. And there's a great video that goes on, shows all the evidence that he's a conspiracy theory. You can sort of work yourself into details here. And this falsificationism in general has problems, and most physics and natural biologists and all these people, they all have a priori synthetic truths, or I would argue they all use sort of a priori synthetic truths that they have in there somewhere. We're making assumptions which aren't falsifiable to use. And actually, assuming the Gaussian or the student, whatever the distribution, the normal distribution, is itself a claim that has to be made. And that's the one thing Taleb brought up, because why should events behave that way? And this comes up with dice as well. I've thought a long time about this problem, and actually there are people that have gone and tried to do this. There is no such thing as a fair dice in theory, except in theory, because little dice have these little things, and you roll them a billion times. The dice, of course, will change, and then you won't get a perfect 1 through 6 distribution. You get an imperfect. Same with coins too. So actually, when you start trying to empirically go after these things, you get all these weird wrinkles, and you get all these sort of real wrinkles. And then, of course, you go into actual social phenomena like wars. As you point out, we're still living in a post-World War II era. European Union, NATO, all the institutions that we rely on, and not rely on, air quotes, have, GATT, all those type agreements were all set up basically in the last 3 years. Even the Soviet Union, Russia today, all those agreements. So we're living in a post-World War II era. And World War II, for a large part, was unpredictable. Now, was it unpredictable for the actors who did it? This is where it gets tricky. And social scientists claim to want to study. This is to me praxeology. This is why I got into. This is why I like people like Mises and Hoppe. What Taleb reminds me is of someone you've been on, I've been on, is Todd Lewis in a way. And I say this with great respect because I'm never quite sure with either their methodology. I think they could produce good content. I think Taleb in particular is, by mixing math at times and not math, come out with good content. But it's never clear what their underlying methodology is or isn't. He also reminds me in a way of Edmund Burke. But of course, Taleb has more math than either the two of them. And actually, in interviews, he stated he doesn't reject statistical models. He just wants better statistic models. And in this regard, I'd say Taleb is honest. He just says his math is better than other people's math. If Harvard statisticians and correlates of War Project and mainstream economists would basically say that would actually be more honest than this sort of, we hide behind math, these models. You get this with people like Nate Silver and their election models. And then again, Taleb went after Nate Silver's election models. So part of the problem lies with what exactly is science. And again, science might work with things like you take a hydrogen, take chemical X, you take chemical Y, you get compound Z. I don't really dispute that. I do have postmodern sympathies, but I don't really dispute that. But in a way, if that doesn't happen, if you take two chemicals and we'd have 10 million things, you get one exception. The exception means it's no longer a rule that you take chemical X, you take chemical Y, and you get compound Z. Once you get one exception, it no longer happens. And this is where people like Walter Block points out, with the minimum wage is you have to retest the model, make a new model. This was pointed out in his debate with Brian Kaplan. So this gets into the ickies of science and what exactly is predictions. So if you define science by predictability, in a way, if phenomena can't easily, phenomenal way to human action, get into this weird gray zone. So Swithin, what do you make about predictability in general regarding science, and what exactly is it? Do you think the mainstream actually has a coherent idea? Do you think my criticisms of human action, for the 9/11 example, for the attackers, they knew it was going to happen. The people who had the tanks when we were about to invade Russia, they knew it was going to happen. Stalin, he was surprised from everyone's understanding that when actually the tanks started rolling in, there were trains still going in from the Soviet Union carrying ore. So it's within.
Yes, with predictability and what is science, I do think that science these days has gone towards the predictive model. I think this is largely due to the abolition of the concept of anything. Well, I was going to say anything having a nature, because if something has a nature and it exhibits certain properties, and if you figure out what the nature is, you there is something you can learn about it, and you know something about reality. If it's the case that that humans are just effectively imposing order onto reality, well, then there's nothing really underlying reality which is actually coherent. All you really need to do is to generate accurate predictions, and this sort of goes to like positivism of the 19th century, and then sort of logical positivism and falsificationism of the earlier 20th. And I do think that that's kind of how science tends to go. Because I mean, in physics, for example, which I don't know hugely well, a lot of the debates in physics are over maths as opposed to what is actually going on. It's about we need to manipulate, make the maths, and so we'll predict how things are going to happen. This is a big issue, obviously, in certain things in quantum mechanics, because you don't really know I don't remember the experiment properly, but basically you can't predict where something's going to end up, or you can't do it very well. So it is definitely kind of gone down that line. Although I think science goes from there, probably from the classic mechanical view of Newton, because all you have is matter and motion. There's no real sort of objective natures, as say Aristotle would have. All there is just sort of these forces, motion, etc., working together, and then you can kind of predict where they're going. So a lot of science now does seem, rather than to figure out what actually exists in the external world, is merely concerned about predicting how it would take place. So, for example, where you were saying, if you do something 99 times, the 100th time it does it differently, then you've got to work out what the rule is wrong. Well, if you have an idea of what something actually is, then you could go, well, actually, we know this is the case. I suppose you could argue that trying to figure out what reality is actually like, rather than just predicting outcomes of it, what's actually there, rather than creating mathematical models of how things will react if something takes place, is that you have some sort of justification to say, well, actually, we know that, I don't know, hydrogen, because we know what the essence of hydrogen is, works in this way. So there's probably maybe something wrong with the model, or something along those lines, which is akin to the sort of what Gary Becker told Walter Block. I think it was Gary Becker, to go and do his minimum wage investigation again in certain cases, because it didn't show that unemployment was resulted by it. So yeah, modern physics does tend to be based on sort of just prediction. There isn't a huge emphasis on figuring out what actually the underlying substrate of what's doing the things that they're predicting. And I think you're right. I should have brought this up earlier. There is a big difference between sort of the natural world and human action. Now, you could argue that humans have a sort of metaphysical sense, a strong version of free will, which means they're unpredictable fundamentally in their nature. And by that I mean me predicting what somebody else would do, rather than what somebody knowing what they would do, because obviously that would be categorically different, because I can't, well, at least not yet. Again, if the idea you have like the private mind, that you can't actually view what you're actually thinking, even if you were to observe your brain states, there's something about consciousness which is private and which is inaccessible, and taking such a view, I think Wittgenstein held that view, that you would not be able to predict what they were going to do. And this is basically Mises' point with sort of like case probability. Every event that humans choose to do things is basically unique, and therefore you can't really ascribe any probability distribution to it, unlike the regularity of the weather. Now, that said, you could then take an indeterminist view of reality. I think this is an argument with respect to the radioactive decay of things. If I remember correctly, you can it's almost impossible, or basically no one can predict when an object will decay at any given point in time, but they can pretty well predict it over a particular time frame of how much we would expect it to decay over, say, like a day or a year or something like that. So yeah, so then you get the question, is reality indeterminate to certain extents? But then the question is whether that's even coherent. It's not something I don't have a settled view on, because to some extent to say that reality is indeterminate is an odd statement, because Einstein, after the things of his general or special relativity, I don't remember which, and it gave the idea that sort of the universe was sort of probabilistic and wasn't sort of deterministic in a certain sense. I think the phrase he said, God doesn't play dice, and spent the rest of his time trying to show that actually the universe was sort of deterministic, despite his sort of relativity theories. My history might be slightly wrong, but that's a general idea, I think. So yeah, I would. So on predictability and probability, I would probably take more of the Misesian view. That said, I think to a large extent, probability and prediction is basically about our ignorance of what might take place, rather than some sort of substrate of the world. I suppose I'm a determinist in a certain sense, in that I think if you had all the knowledge about all the physical states, you would be able to work out what would happen next with a probability of 1. The problem is the reality is so complex. Whether you have all the all relevant factors is the problem. That's why probability in prediction is fine in things like cards and dice. Now, notwithstanding about the fair dice never existing, etc., but at least you know how a dice can, in principle, possibly land, assuming it remains as like a 6-sided cube. So you can kind of beforehand, you can exhaustively know all the possibilities, which of course you can't do in reality, especially with all the with all the interplay and the complexity that generates, which then does significantly circumscribe the usefulness of probabilities and things, which I think is interesting. Back to Taleb directly, how he says, you want to use some more simple rules. You don't want to have these heavily elaborate sort of regulation of sort of financial sector. You just want skin in the game. You want somebody who is running and making decisions to be able to feel to have some form of financial loss if he makes an error, rather than working all these sort of optimization models, etc., because you can game those and they might not follow reality properly. You just want genuine incentive. And I think Taleb is most important in certain respects. Is what matters is, in a sense, which is consistent with a view of economics, although he says he doesn't like economists, is one of incentives. If you can have genuine incentives for such that you do well, you're rewarded, and if you do badly, you're punished, then you're probably going to make better decisions than would otherwise exist, even if. So it's better to have skin in the game and basically no theoretical model of empirics than to have a really, really theoretical model which you say is going to work, but you have no skin in the game. And I think that's broadly true. So that was a long-winded general statement on predictability. But yes, Tim, any comments or further things you want to go?
Yeah, Taleb may not have the answers, and technically if Taleb is correct, this is a point that Gary North brought up in his critique of him he called Einstein Keynes. There actually is no fundamental answer. If reality with or without minds is fundamentally indeterminate, then if you describe science as predictability, then science can't actually explain anything, because everything's indeterminate. And this is if minds didn't exist. If minds with free will or or basically compatibilist, as if free will didn't exist, and reality is basically indeterminate, then what exactly can science actually tell us? I mean, eventually the planets will change their orbits, and the universe will collapse. everything will come into a black hole. I mean, this is basically, I'm paraphrasing and going in sort of a short version of it. But if I ask cosmologists, I think this is basically what they think will happen. Everything will run out of energy, from my understanding, or something like that. Again, it's difficult to get these. It's difficult to get these people down with hard. For as much as they talk about making testable hypotheses, at times it's not clear they have testable hypotheses. And in some ways, Taleb is ahead of the curve by so clearly defining his predictability as the sort of thing. He takes out the essence of these sort of Aristotelian sort of inbuilt essences. Let me quick pull up here this is Gary North's quote. Mises defended the free market economy because it was the outcome of deductive logic of human action coupled with informed free choices by rational, self-interested people. Hayek, Mises' early convert to capitalism, defended the free market on an inductivist basis. I surmise, nobody knows what is true, because nothing can be said to be permanently true, so maybe the best ideas win in this phase of social evolution. He built the case for freedom on the survival of the fittest, ideas, institutions, and moral rules. So does Taleb. I wrote about this in Hayek's Thought in 1982, The Evolutionist Defense of the Free Market. This is in Gary North's book, The Dominion Covenant. So self-contradiction is made culturally to be shameful, a matter that can prove to be disastrous in science. So this goes back to the point I was just making about, if reality is fundamentally indeterminate and science is defined by prediction, then things will constantly change. And this is your point about knowledge. Hayek's critique of socialism, we don't have enough knowledge. No one knows all the facts, and that's why we can't have socialism. You can take sort of third way positions in between the two. And Mises doesn't reject the planning, interestingly. Actually, Mises himself doesn't. People plan. People make plans. And people can use knowledge. So in this regard, Mises is the one who doesn't reject the planning. He asks a true Hayekian, can you actually make plans? And that's where it becomes much more unclear regarding knowledge, predictability, and so forth. So your point about Richard Mises' brother is very key, and his sort of form of mathematics is very key. Taleb takes an in-between view, but I would argue Taleb is ahead of the curve in that regard, because he correctly understands that he describes science the way that science actually ends up happening. And yet, and again, Einstein Keynes, and it's Keynes the probabilist that Taleb likes, not Keynes the economist. And Taleb does like economists. He likes Marx, by the way. He likes Adam Smith, from my understanding. He likes Hayek. He just doesn't like the Cass-Sunstein and Nudger types. Neither did I, really. I actually agree. What Taleb describes as economists, I actually agree, and I think you and Swithin would agree as well. So in general, I would put Taleb in the ahead of the curve, pure Popperian analyst, which he's pretty good. Again, he doesn't have all the answers, and actually, if you take him seriously, there is no such thing as answers. He just contradictions. One year one thing might be true, the next year something else. And I think to get such a pure view on that is quite interesting. And if there's such a thing as an anti-cathedral that exists, I would say he's in it along with Hein Rand and various other people. Hoppe. I think he deserves a spot in there. And again, him on COVID, and this is where we'll get into the precautionary principle, which will be part 2 of this episode. Him on COVID, in some ways he's more pure and more folksy. And this is a point that you brought up. He's not a statistical model. He's not implying a statistical model. He's just taking this on this sort of risk basis. So that basically concludes this first episode we're doing. So Swithin, do you have any final comments on Taleb before the next episode, Swithin?
I think your characterization is broadly accurate. Being sort of an in-between thinker. I'd just like to thank you now for discussing this with me, and I'd like to thank everyone else for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share and subscribe to us on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.